Brilliant. So we're part of the Identifying the Disoeuvre, the Artistic Labour Beyond the Oeuvre panel. And I'm with Raksha Patel and my name is Matilda Pye. And we're going to do our recordings together. And we're focusing on the question of the ambiguity of the term artist-educator, reflecting on a good 20 years worth of practice. So Raksha, can you talk to that ambiguity about this term artist-educator?
Yeah, thank you, Matty. So the term artist-educator, it's one that continues to be talked about today. What exactly is an artist-educator, and what does it mean when an artist is not an educator? Can they still educate? It's complicated and it is ambiguous, and it's a term that keeps changing. It raises questions on whether our place as artists is to educate, or is it simply to evoke questions that have answers which are not wrong or right. I recall the term gallery education changing to gallery learning in the mid-2000s. And I felt at the time to educate meant that you were being dictatorial, and our approach to engaging with works in the gallery shouldn't be that and should be different to what happens in the classroom. And I found this problematic and perhaps patronizing to school teachers who were also practicing artists. And this in turn created unnecessary divisions. It was ironic, though, that artists seemed to be the last people that had a say in how a learning programme should be shaped in the gallery. And these decisions came from the institution and were connected to the national curriculum due to funding. And I remember saying many a times in frustration that the works in the collection were not made for the national curriculum in mind. And why should we be restricted to what we teach and deliver? I got into gallery teaching, gallery education in 1997. And one of the reasons was that as a fine arts student, I wanted a job that would leave me time rich, and to continue learning about art history and contemporary art, and to leave me feeling creative. And gallery education did this and much more. And what I found over time, that a side of me that wasn't visible in the studio emerged through working with groups. And that was to be experimental, to take risks, and to fearlessly explore, to not worry about outcome. And another side of this, hugely valuable, was that I was meeting people that I wouldn't normally meet through the art world, and to learn from them. And this was heightened and made even more possible when the learning manager had the skills to trust the artist and to encourage them to do their thing. And I felt this dynamic was more common when the gallery producer was an artist themselves. It's been problematic when an institution has an agenda and worries that the project isn't meeting all their tick boxes. And it's stressful when there isn't enough funding to hand to deliver an expectation to make something really ambitious. It's simply not feasible at times. And despite these hurdles, as a freelancer, you have to always smile, and you have to accommodate the institution for the fear of not being employed again, which is really difficult. And I think it's even harder when you're the kind of artist that asks challenging questions. And I've always done that. And I really enjoy doing it publicly in the gallery, because it brings in a range of audiences outside of your group that can engage and listen in. And it debunks this perception of who teaches in the gallery, and that it doesn't have to be necessarily refined and polite. It can be a challenging subject matter. Having said that, I sometimes do feel like I'm a service provider in my role. And I've become more accepting of this rather than be frustrated, because there are many positives, such as learning subject areas that fall outside your studio practice. For instance, my role at the Founding Museum led me to unpick all these obscure stories of real people that lived in the King's Cross and Holborn areas. And this fed into a painting that I made for UAL, which focused on social history and the gentrification of the area. But I think one of the best things that I'm seeing over being in gallery education a long time is that people that I've taught as young people in gallery initiatives like Tate Collective are now my peers and are working alongside me as educators and lecturers. And if it were not for these projects, I don't think that our art colleges would be as diverse as they currently are. And I feel the diversity has come through these initiatives and having faith in young people. However, it's still sad that there's a stigma around gallery education, in that it seems like the poorer cousin of what happens in art colleges, and that art college is more conceptual or more intellectual. And I found that gallery education is actually far more progressive in its discussions of race, class, sexual orientation, and is inclusive in that way. And we were working inclusively, 20 years ago or more. And I think this is related to who works in the gallery, which is mainly women and people of colour, in comparison to who works in art college. And today it feels like art colleges are catching up with gallery learning or gallery education, as we've been ahead of the game for many years.
Brilliant. Thank you, Raksha.
And I should reverse this question for you, or ask you this question. As a learning manager or a gallery producer working for the institution, what does an artist educator, that term, mean to you?
Well, it's one learning manager is one I reject, but I'm still contemplating the term artist educator, and it's meant really different things to me at different times. And when I stumbled into, or I started working at the Tate in the learning department, artist educator for me was someone like Phila de Barlow, people who worked in an art school, but I also saw as educators. And I thought of them in relationship to their students rather than to their institutions. And certainly when I worked in higher education, worked in art schools, I was most interested in the students. And I think that teaching in higher education has been hugely devalued over time, and art schools have become these kind of global brands. But that wasn't entirely why I left. But it was sort of shocking to me when I look back, coming to work in a museum after working in an art school with lots of middle-aged men, because there were so many women, and I had to really think about that, and I had to really negotiate it. And I actually felt that Flick had employed me to be the bull in the china shop. But at the Tate, that's where I discovered people who professionalized this term artist educator, largely through taking museum studies courses in places like Leicester and writing for organizations like Engage. And I think that those discrepancies between people who were teachers or educated in the humanities and people who were artist educated were very different. And I was suspicious of the sort of humanities route, I suppose. And I think I was unsure about what success looked like for them, or rather for whom it was a success. And I'm hinting at the voice of participants in the work that was done. And in sort of contesting the professionalizing of gallery education, for me, that was rooted in, being someone who learns through and makes sense of things by doing them and working them out and talking them out on the ground. And I didn't really want to theorize or administrate it in that way, because I felt comfortable with the risk, with the failures, and with things continuously changing. But if I'm honest, I think I thought of it as a role in which it was a kind of useful, interesting setting and a way to make a moderate income. Now I think I feel more comfortable with the term producer. And I think that's because it feels more interdisciplinary and more consciously social. And probably, in my sort of favourite projects, what you're creating or co-creating is some social tools to experiment with, to try things out, and to collectively test and to share that agency. And the attempt is to try and amplify that back to the institution or to any potential audience. I've definitely learnt the most when things have gone wrong, and I'm interested in knowing when to remove language, to sit down with a bar of soap and a potato peeler, or pour photographic chemicals into a bucket, because this is where knowledge is co-produced and shared, and where the hierarchies start to dissolve a bit. I think I've learned to be a better guest and when to be a better host. I've become more conscious as I've got older about how much I learn through museums and galleries, and it absolutely resonates with me, being part of handing over to the next generation and supporting and celebrating the people that we've worked with in museums and galleries and seeing them fly. And I would celebrate the way in which the education, the learning, the co-production in the gallery with artists is both social and empathetic, and where it's different to art schools and the culture of that, which what I experienced was one which was often pretty brutal at those vulnerable intersections, particularly gender, race, class, and sexual orientation. So artist-educator work feels successful to me when it's a democratic process which is horizontal rather than vertical. And ultimately that's where you feel trusted at both ends. What I'm currently really interested in is working on is whether the institution is ready to be educated and whether they have the capacity to listen. And this is partly in response to a colleague based in Mumbai, Jyoti Roy, who came to London and was researching co-curation and participatory methodologies, really. And Jyoti says, the museum can only have a voice when its ears are bigger than its mouth. If the museum is to be participatory, it must first set up all the apparatus it needs to keep listening to what's happening around it. And I think my role at its best has been to try and keep listening to everything and everyone that's happening around me. And I would say I'm art school educated, and my education has continued in the museum and the gallery. So thank you, Raksha.
Thank you, Matty. That was fantastic, really insightful to hear all these thoughts.